Greetings to all of you. I've just put out my YouTube video on this upcoming solar eclipse on March 29th, and I wanted to follow it up with a video about the impact of this eclipse on the United States because it's located in the chart of the United States in some very significant aspects. And I know that this is a turbulent time in the world and a very turbulent time of change and polarization in the United States. And I wanted to give some sense of how this solar eclipse may be trying to guide us here in the United States with the process that we're in. As I get into this, I want to preface this by saying, as those of you in my community know, I really make it a point to not get into politics or to step into the polarization that is so rampant in the world in this time. In that to do that, we're fueling the division and the discord and the turbulence when we're all being called to move into higher consciousness and into the Aquarian paradigms, which are about how do we come back into collaboration with each other? How do we come back into community and right relationship with each other? That's the key. But I'm impacted by the comments and questions that come from those of you in the community. And many of you have been talking about how challenging this time is in terms of how do we navigate the turbulence around us and how it's impacting us personally at the same time that we're trying to hold these frequencies and energies of love and higher consciousness in the world. And it is, I think, one of our biggest challenges right now. Because as I've described in earlier videos, I feel like we're seeing two-dimensional realities unfolding on the earth right now, or two timelines. One timeline that is really about those of us that are moving into higher consciousness and are trying to move more and more fully into the Aquarian paradigms and live that out in our day-to-day lives. And then there's this other dimensional reality or timeline that's not on that path of fifth dimensional consciousness, but is still mired in the third dimensional reality and caught increasingly in the turbulence, the confusion, the chaos of the deconstruction that's happening of these paradigms of the past, and particularly the deconstruction of the power over patriarchal paradigms that we're moving out of as we're exiting the time of the Kali Yuga and moving into ascending consciousness and moving into the Aquarian Age. But we're in this liminal time. We're in this transition time. How do we navigate that? How do we be on that path of higher consciousness and be here in this reality straddling the worlds? So I'd like to talk about that and specifically talk about some of how that may be playing out in the United States, but it's really a global issue. And as you know, most of my videos are about how do we deal with this shift as humanity and not get caught in national divisions or political conflicts or partisan ideology. Part of the challenge for all of us of being in this liminal time is that we are needing to find the ways to more and more be living those Aquarian paradigms in the world now and not waiting for it to all unfold or for it to happen to us. Part of the meaning of the Aquarian Age is stepping into our own personal responsibility. As many of you know, my description of the Aquarian Age is the sovereignty of the self in the sanctity of community, in unity with cosmic consciousness. That part of what's important as we're moving into the Aquarian Age is taking responsibility for our own identity, our own actions, And I think being in that sovereignty of the self is finding that way to be aligned with our soul self and live from right action, right loving, right knowing. To be in that higher consciousness, living from our hearts and acting in harmony and right relationship with all that is. Let me talk a little bit about how this solar eclipse is specifically impacting the United States, and then I'll circle back to that larger issue of how do we navigate this turbulent time in our day-to-day reality. Part of the catalyst for me talking specifically about the United States is in my recent conversation with Ray Grossi, and I encourage you to see that video if you haven't already. He has such wisdom to share with all of us. But one of the comments that he made is how profound it is that the United States has been in its Pluto return, then its Chiron return, and is moving into its Uranus return. The United States was in its Pluto return in 2022, all of 2022. In its Chiron return from April of 2024 through February of this year. And it will be fully in the Uranus return beginning in July 2027 through May 2028. However, as we know, Uranus is moving into Gemini this July and will be within a 5-degree orb of Uranus in the United States chart beginning in June of 2026. So this is a powerful transformational time for this country and its impact on the rest of the world. And I think to highlight the themes of these transits, with Pluto in Capricorn in the second house in the chart of the United States, remember that Pluto is that planet that speaks to what is our evolutionary journey of the soul. What is the journey of consciousness that we're in at this time? And Pluto in Capricorn in the second house is about the importance of our looking at our values, at how we work with our resources, our economy, second house, how we forge our own sense of identity and manifest that in the forms and structures of the country, Capricorn. And remember, from that evolutionary astrology perspective, our growing edge is Pluto's polarity point, which lands here on Mercury in Cancer in the 8th house. How do we see ourselves and others through the eyes of compassion and be in our own alignment with our inner knowing as a country to really be living out of patterns of Cancer, of compassion, of being sensitive and caring towards others? But remember, when you're in a Pluto return, it's guiding us through a time of transformation and to revisit those values, that sense of identity, that way in which we're using our resources and structuring our government and our economy. And the deeper intent of a Pluto return is to burn away whatever is out of alignment with that deeper intention of Pluto in guiding us in our evolution of consciousness to be in alignment with our path and purpose. But if we're not dealing with that consciously, that Pluto return can become about an abuse of power. Remember, Pluto is the planet that is guiding us to align our will with the will and energies of cosmic consciousness. But if we're caught in a lower level of consciousness, Pluto becomes about how do I empower my own ego, my own separate sense of self, and can be manifest in abuse of power. So for the United States, that's some of the challenge. Are we then working that in a deeper transformational process or getting more and more mired in an abuse of power and being out of balance in our values and in how we're working the structures of our country and our economy? I think the Chiron return is particularly powerful for the United States in that this Chiron return is in Aries in the fourth house and is in a square with the sun. The sun in the chart of a nation is our sense of identity as a nation. So the Chiron return, the theme of that is what early wounds do we need to heal from our past history in order to claim our healing gifts? When you've got Chiron in the birth chart of the United States, in a square with the sun, it can indicate that the foundational identity of this country was tied up with wounds around the sense of self and self-expression. And it's in the fourth house, in Aries. So it's very much about what were the foundational origins of this country and what were the wounds at the root of the formation of this country. And we're using as the birth chart July 4th, 1776. If you recall, a lot of the immigrants coming to the United States from England, from Europe, in the 1600s to begin to chart out a new life were leaving Europe and escaping England in particular because of the tyrannical monarchy at that time that they felt was both blocking them from certain religious freedoms or freedom of speech, but also creating a very imbalanced power over dynamic and inequities in terms of the economy and capacity to make a decent wage, a decent living. There was a division between those who had wealth and those who were poor and impoverished. So the immigrants that came to the United States to start a new world, a new country for themselves, were coming out of that effort to escape an abuse of power, and particularly these tyrannical monarchies in Europe. So this is the wound that was at the root of this country's origins and the way in which it had left those who were fleeing feeling powerless or feeling caught in this perpetrator-victim dynamic that I talked about in my earlier solar eclipse video, that is that wounding dynamic in this patriarchal period of power over paradigms that we've been in the time of the Kali Yuga, starting at 4000 BC up through the present. So the initial early immigrants to this country were coming with that wound of feeling victimized or feeling powerless or feeling like they couldn't carve out the life they wanted for themselves or have the freedom of expression or the capacity to move forward in their lives economically because of an abusive power over structure in the lands that they left behind. What's interesting, as I described in that earlier solar eclipse video, is when we're caught in that dialectic or dynamic of perpetrator-victim, we get caught in that repetitive pattern of being either the victim or the perpetrator until we heal and can break out of that pattern and reclaim a more centered, heal, whole sense of self. So here you have so many of the early immigrants coming to escape a destructive, abusive power over structure, who arrive at, and land here in this country, who then, in the beginnings of the country, become the perpetrators themselves. So we see in the 1600s that so many of the immigrants coming from Britain or coming from Europe began to get into wars with the indigenous people here, stealing their land, destroying the native tribes that were here, and becoming the perpetrators themselves. And then we also have developing in the 1600s and more extremely into the 1700s, the beginning of the African slave trade, of stealing resources and stealing human beings from other countries to be in service here and in enslavement here in a very abusive, power over, destructive dynamic. So the immigrants who arrived, who'd been fleeing their experience of victimization in Europe, become the perpetrators here on this land and in the formation of the United States. So the Chiron return, I believe, was calling this country to look at what were those values at the origins of the formation of this country and the ideals, which were about freedom, equality, justice, human rights. But what played out in the wounding that those who'd come here to found this nation had experienced, and then the way in which they flipped from being victims to perpetrators, is the wounding that comes from the power over structures that affects the sense of self and affects our actions and keeps us bound in that perpetrator victim dialectic. And I think this Chiron return was saying it is time to heal those wounds, that trauma, that way of perpetuating that victim perpetrator dynamic, so that we can actually be in alignment with the original vision and ideals that this country was based on, which are also seen in Neptune in the ninth house. And we will be moving into this Uranus opposition, which I think will be challenging those of us in this country to see the truth of who we are, how we interact with others, our beliefs, and how they are shaping our actions. But right now, with this solar eclipse on March 29th, that eclipse at 9 degrees of Aries lands in conjunction with the root of the chart, is squaring the sun and Jupiter and Venus, and is opposite Saturn in the 10th house. So I see this solar eclipse as a profound wake-up call for this country. And Chiron is still in aspect to Chiron in the chart of the United States. And this whole powerful configuration of the energies in Pisces and in Aries are all landing in the third and fourth houses of the chart of the United States. And I think calling us in this country to look at our beliefs, to look at our actions, and to really reevaluate who we are and the choices that we're making. And it's significant that the lunar nodes have also been in alignment with this vertical axis and are a part of this powerful configuration at the root of the chart. It's also significant that Pluto is moving into conjunction with the south node in the chart of the United States, and Uranus is squaring the moon. I think this Pluto coming into connection with the South Node is, again, look at who we are, who we've been, and are we in right alignment with how we are as a country in our interactions with each other and with the rest of the world. South Node in Aquarius. Are we living out of those Aquarian paradigms, or are we operating out of the imbalanced paradigms of the past and that dynamic of perpetrator victim? We're meant, North Node and Leo in the 8th house, to be living from that inner knowing and coming from our hearts, to be expressing ourselves in a way that is about being in these Aquarian paradigms with ourselves, with each other, to live from justice, truth, authenticity, collaboration, equality. So and Uranus is squaring the moon, calling us to see the truth of what we feel, the truth of how we're interacting with each other, challenging us to look at our beliefs and our emotions. Moon in Aquarius in the 3rd house. We're being called to really look at ourselves as a country and to take responsibility for our choices and our behavior. And we're being called to look at the roots of our origins and how we then manifest who we are in the world. And it's significant that the midheaven in the chart of the United States is Libra. And in the solar eclipse video, I talk a lot about the meaning of Libra being about being in right relationship, right harmony with others. Those are the ideals of this nation, but we're being called by this eclipse and these powerful transits to look at, are we actually living out of those ideals, or are we caught in out of balanced power over paradigms? And again, if we don't heal the wounds of the past, we tend to unconsciously continue to reenact them in a way that's re-traumatizing to ourselves or to others. And I think these transits, in a very significant way, are activating those wounds to bring them into our awareness, to support us in healing as a nation. But if you're not working the Chiron return or these other transits with Pluto and Uranus consciously, it can mean that those unresolved wounds of the past that we've pushed out of our awareness get re-triggered and reenacted in the present moment. And remember, the beginning origins of the immigrants coming here were fleeing a tyrannical monarchy. Think about what's at work in the United States right now and what we're moving towards in terms of our structure as a country. Again, I don't think there's any value in getting caught in partisan politics or polarization or division, but I do think this solar eclipse is saying we need to look at ourselves as a country here in the United States, and we need to take, each of us, take responsibility for our own choices and our actions and our ways of being. That's true for all of us globally. But let's talk about what that can mean, how we can work with that in the midst of these dynamics and intense turbulent energies here in the United States and in the world. I think we each have to attune to how we can do our own inner healing work to step out of that perpetrator victim dynamic that is the destructive consequence of being in power over paradigms. We've been enculturated in those power over paradigms. in this period of patriarchy across the last 6,000 years, but particularly across the last 4 to 5,000 years. So we have come to feel like this is the way of life. And we either feel caught in fear and victimization and powerlessness and helplessness, or caught in that perpetrator model, those in power, seeking more power, abusing power, operating out of corruption or greed or manipulation or exploitation or war or destruction. We're needing to heal that pattern and break out of that polarity, to come back to center, to remember who we truly are, to remember that this is the low level of consciousness for humanity. And that when we can release that, we can remember the ancient wisdom of the past, which was about living in community and collaboration, living in right relationship with each other, living in connection with the cosmos and with the earth, coming back into interconnectedness and interdependence. The ending of the Kali Yuga, these powerful configurations that we've been in astrologically, the movement into the age of Aquarius, being in ascending consciousness, is all about remembering and reconfiguring our lives to be moving into new paradigms that are about living in right relationship, harmony, balance, justice, truth, compassion, being in collaborative community. But again, how do we deal with this when we're in this turbulence and this transformational time where we're seeing some of these power over paradigms now on steroids? Here in the United States, in the world, the last gasp of the patriarchal paradigms are making themselves powerfully known, creating an even more fierce dialectic of perpetrator victim around the world. I think the first step for us individually is, as I've talked about in so many of my videos, we have to do our own healing process to clear our unique history, ancestral history, personal history of trauma. Because if we don't, we will be caught in that dynamic and keep replaying it and reenacting it, one end of the spectrum over the other. But as we can heal, we come back into wholeness. We come back to center. We come back to more clarity, that we don't have to keep being caught in that traumatic pattern, that we have other choices. It's when we heal that we have freedom of choice, and we have this capacity to see things differently and to take responsibility for our choices and feel more aligned in our sovereignty of self. No longer controlled by the power over dynamics around us, no longer caught in fear or caught in reactivity and anger, which continues the polarization and the power over dynamic. We get to step out of that, be in the witness self, move into alignment with our soul self, be in our own inner truth, and act from that place. And that way of acting can be a full spectrum of possibilities, depending on who you are, what your unique gifts are, what you're being guided to do that's in alignment with your soul self and your path and your purpose. But I think the key is keep tuning in to any way that you're getting caught in fear or anger or reactivity, because that feeds and fuels the polarization and pulls you right back in to that destructive power over dynamic that plays out in perpetrator victim dynamics. I also think it's critical as we're moving through this shift to honor the reemergence of the sacred feminine wisdom that guides us in how to be in harmony and how to be in right relationship with each other and all that is. And I talk some about that in my solar eclipse video, but I want to talk about that in a more practical sense here. In ancient Egypt, where there was that understanding of maat, the principle of living in truth, justice, right harmony, it is significant that that was embedded in the structure of the culture. This is ancient Egypt. Later, Egypt got caught very much in the patriarchal power over paradigms. But in its origins, it was very much about living in right connection with the earth and cosmos and in alignment with cosmic order, to be living in harmony and balance with all that is. Those were the principles of Ma'at. I do not harm the waters or the earth or other people. I do not lie. I do not operate out of greed. I do not steal other people's resources. I do not kill. It's all about being in right harmony, not only in how we act, but in those ways of perceiving and knowing and how we're living from the heart. Remember, the core of living in right harmony is right action, right loving, right knowing. Are we in balance and in harmony? Or are we acting in ways and reacting in ways that are about impulsivity or getting caught in fear or caught in anger, pulled back into that power over destructive dynamic of perpetrator victim? In the midst of the tumult in the world and the injustice and the ways in which across the world we're seeing more and more authoritarian leaders striving for power over, conquest, control, moving in, activating wars, exploiting the earth's resources, and increasing division between the wealthy and the rest of humanity. How do we work that? Part of what I would say is, first of all, and most importantly, do this process of healing so that you can be in right alignment, in your center, living from your heart, moving into higher consciousness, because then you are emanating that out into the world. You're living it in your interactions, in your day-to-day life, and you're emanating that out into the collective consciousness. And that way of energetically activating it in the morphogenic field of our collective consciousness is one of the most powerful forms of social action that you can do. You know, I love that my good friend Pam Gregory is doing these meditations to gather us as a global community to be visualizing this new world that we can co-create together, to be energizing it. Because as Joe Dispenza would say, where your attention goes is where your energy goes. So if we're caught in the confusion and tumult of this time, that's where our energy is going. But if we're putting our attention into being on a path of higher consciousness and living from love, that's where our energy is going. That's what we're activating. That's what we're helping to manifest as we collectively are supporting each other and co-creating a new world together. But as we're confronted by, in our day-to-day lives, those impacts of this ongoing third dimensional, lower level power over paradigm that's still active, I encourage you to live where you are locally, to stand up for truth and justice and right relationship. We each may feel called to hold those paradigms of the Aquarian Age where we are the ways in which we can be fostering our own local community of like-minded people, to be supporting each other and how we're activating and co-creating these new ways of being. Here in my own community, I'm very involved in a Water Protection Alliance, a group that we've formed to be protecting the watershed and conserving land from harmful development. I'm also involved in supporting the People's Health Alliance and how we can be co-creating new healthcare systems that are more in alignment with the Aquarian Age and out of the power over paradigm of pharmaceutical companies and insurance companies controlling our healthcare, which no longer becomes about healthcare. It becomes about power over and profit. And I think that's part of the theme as we move into the Aquarian Age. Instead of trying to reform the paradigms of the past or hope that political leaders will somehow fix all of this mess, we need to step into the sovereignty of self, activate our collaborating in community with each other to be co-creating new forms and systems and structures. The People's Health Alliance and the Food and Farm Alliance being activated around the globe are all examples of those Aquarian paradigms of let's pull our energy from the dysfunctional patterns that are at work in the world and activate new ways of being. Part of what I try to do in my videos is support those who I see as Aquarian innovators who are activating, pioneering, supporting these new paradigms. I encourage you in terms of healthcare to listen to my interviews with John White, who is such a deeply spiritual man living from his heart and developing these cutting edge ways of working with frequency and scale our energies to support us and empower us in our own healing process. That's his core mission, is how do we help each other heal and be empowered to be responsible for our own healing journeys. And John Stuart Reid is doing that in his own way. There are so many people doing such beautiful, pioneering, creative work in the world. We can align with them, support them. We can be them and step into our own creative gifts and what we uniquely can bring into the world to be supporting and manifesting these new forms. Look into the transition towns that are getting developed around the world, which are consciously designing their local communities to develop new economies, new educational systems, new ways of being in community together, to be fostering equality, collaboration, justice, and having the systems and structures of their communities reflecting those new paradigms. So I think we need to hold the energies of love and higher consciousness, emanate that out into the world, and act from that place and be co-creating these new forms. And I think some of what's going to be important as we're in this transition time is also knowing when, in whatever situation we're in, if we're being confronted with something that is actively destructive in our community, in our own lives, how we don't react in fear or submit out of an old coping pattern of freeze or flight or dissociation, but also not get pulled into the other way of coping with trauma or getting triggered, which is fighting and getting reactive and angry and lashing out at the injustice. That again keeps us caught in that trauma pattern of perpetrator victim. But we can stay strong in our truth and in our alignment with higher consciousness and with our hearts and say, no, enough is enough. There's an example of this that I find profound that has stayed with me across the years. But in the 90s, in 1994, there was an uprising in Chiapas in Mexico. I know about Chiapas because an early shamanic teacher that I had lived in Chiapas, and it is historically an area of Mexico where many of the people are poor and many are really of the indigenous cultures of Mexico, including many Mayans. And there was an uprising in 1994 where they were really trying to call the government into more equality, more rights for indigenous people, more land rights, more reform to allow more equality for the people in Chiapas and in the country. This led to the threat of military action, where the military was moving to invade Chiapas and stop this uprising. Significantly, a lot of the leaders in this uprising, in this movement, were women and longing to foster that sense of right harmony, right relationship. And as the military were coming with their soldiers, their tanks to move into Chiapas, people from this group in Chiapas and a lot of women and children stood across the road in a non-violent protest, basically standing in front of the military moving into their territory, saying, enough is enough. It wasn't a reactive military or violent uprising on their part. It was a non-violent protest saying, enough is enough. And we are willing to stand and risk our lives to say, stop. And women and children and grandmothers held hands and stood across the road and challenged the soldiers and the tanks, and they turned back. What a metaphor for how, if we can step out of fear and can really stand in our truth and in alignment with higher consciousness, to remember who we are and who we can be as a global community, we can look when we're confronted with these episodes of power over and destructiveness and violence and say, enough. Enough is enough. The key is we have to both step out of fear and align in community and activate this growing movement of those of us who are awakening, who are moving into higher consciousness, who are living from our hearts, who are in alignment with justice and peace and right relationship, to stand together to say enough is enough, and to be actively living out these new paradigms so that it isn't just a protest against, it's a proactive movement towards these paradigms of the Aquarian Age and this new world that we can co-create together. So I do think that a part of our living this alignment with the new paradigms and coming from our center and breaking out of the power over perpetrator victim dynamic is to stand in our truth, to stand for justice, to take action, to be moving towards what we value and what it means to be in right relationship with each other with those around us who are suffering and in need, with the earth, to honor her and her resources, to be back in connection with the earth, back in alignment with cosmic order, back in right harmony with all that is. I believe that as we allow these energies of the earth and cosmos to support us in healing and moving into higher consciousness and aligning with these new paradigms, we will be living from our inner truth and inner knowing about what is mine to do, what in this moment is right action, right loving, right knowing. And it can be whatever we're meant to do to be in that right alignment and energizing and manifesting those new paradigms and ways of being. And it's important to know, in terms of stepping into that alignment and stepping out of fear, that taking that right action and standing in truth, standing up for justice and equality and compassion and peace doesn't always mean the outcome will work out well. Those women and children standing across the road protecting Chiapas didn't know if the tanks were going to stop or destroy them. But when we're not caught in fear and we remember that we are soul selves having a human experience, I don't know, then there is a fearlessness in standing in the moment in right alignment with who we are and what we're meant to do. There have been many moments in my own life where I feel that almost exhilaration and lack of fear of being in alignment with my center and living from that right action, right loving, right knowing. But we all move in and out of that. We all move in and out of being centered. And I think part of the beauty of being in this community is we can keep supporting each other and coming back to center and being in alignment with higher consciousness. But there was a crisis moment for me in my early 40s, and I was a clinical director of a local agency, mental health agency, that was serving underserved populations and really trying to bring services to families and children and people in poverty in the area where I lived. And at that time, I was living alone. And as you might imagine, being the clinical director of this kind of agency, the salary was not great. So I was barely making it, covering my monthly expenses, but the work was profoundly meaningful to me. And I loved supporting the staff and creating a really collaborative, caring community in the agency so that we could be caring for the clients that we were seeing. In the midst of this, the agency, trying to deal with its own financial struggles, brought in a new manager who restructured the agency to be saving more money and streamlining the budget. And he started firing some of the critical senior supervisors in the agency who had the greatest experience, brought the greatest wisdom and guidance to the staff, because it was costing too much. And then he was hiring very inexperienced new graduates who would come in to be the therapists to save money. So his whole policy of how he was structuring the agency was about profit and not about people, and not about the mission of our agency. And he came in and presented this to our staff. And I remember feeling in that meeting just these energies move through me, and my being called by my spirit guides into alignment with truth and justice. And I stood up and I confronted him. And I challenged him and I said, this is not right. This is not just. This is not in alignment with the mission of the agency. And he was furious. And I remember after that meeting being caught in my own angst and anxiety. I could lose my job. And this manager was extremely angry that I would speak out in the staff meeting rather than just acquiescing to this new policy, and did move to fire me and anyone else who is challenging him. And I went in and resigned and left the agency without any clue how I was going to manage things financially. And as it worked out, I was able to work some ways to be in transition, collect unemployment for a period of time, move into exploring other options. Across about a 6 to 8 week period, I managed to stabilize things and be supported into moving into a new situation. But it was important for me to take that action, not knowing the outcome, not being attached to the outcome, and being willing to take a risk. Because part of this challenge of this time is, do we get caught in fear? Do we get caught in survival mode? I need to do this, or I'm going to be under assault, or I'm going to be attacked, or it's not going to be safe. And I want to be clear, there were other staff in that agency who didn't stand up and speak their truth because they were responsible. They were single parents, responsible for children. It was not in right alignment for them to take that step. So I think that's really important. We each have to take responsibility for our own choices and what's in right harmony and right balance and right relationship with my soul self and with my inner knowing in this moment. And for some of them, it was, I need to be in right harmony and right relationship with who I am as a conscious parent. So there is no clear answer for how we navigate or negotiate these times, but the key is being in alignment with our soul self, our inner knowing, the guidance that we receive from our spirit guides, the ways these energies of the sky and the earth are trying to support us in seeing the path of healing, awakening, moving into higher consciousness, co-creating a new world, and how those of us who are bridging this transition can be clear moment by moment how we live that out in right action, right loving, right knowing, when to say no, when to be energizing, moving towards these new paradigms. How are we living and embodying this new way of being that is integrating the rising energies of the sacred feminine to live in right relationship with all that is? So whether you're in the turbulence here in the United States, wherever you are in the world, we're all facing this crisis, this dilemma, this time of transition, and being guided and supported in how to clear and heal the paradigms of the past individually to support the healing collectively, so that together more and more of us are co-creating this new world that is about truth and justice and love and compassion and collaboration and right harmony. So let's support each other in navigating this liminal time and in supporting each other in stepping into our own sovereignty of the self, to take responsibility for who we are, to live out of that alignment with our own path and purpose in this time, and to co-create with each other, to be supporting each other and aligning with each other, to be fostering this larger and larger global community of those of us who are manifesting energies of healing and love and compassion and peace and living in harmony with all that is. Thank you to this community for the ways that we are doing that together and being a part of the global healing community. Blessings and love to all of you. Blessed be.